Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the surprisingly dull and frankly often quite smelly world of a medieval alchemist diligently stirring their way towards fortune and supposedly enlightenment. Imagine, if you will, less dramatic flashes of light and more, just an endless amount of patiently watching pots bubble. You'll be surrounded by bizarre glassware cryptic texts and the constant nagging hope that this time the lead will actually turn into gold. And let's be honest, if this were actually you back then, given the state of early chemical safety and the tendency to taste test things that glow, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. Mercury poisoning is not a good look even in the Dark Ages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread out across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all begins, as these things sometimes do not, with a grand prophecy or a shimmering vision, but with a rather mundane letter. A distant relative, great uncle Alaric, a man you vaguely remember as smelling faintly of singed linen and obscure herbs, has, as they say, shuffled off this mortal coil. And in his exceedingly brief will, he's left you his most prized possession, his workshop. You weren't particularly close, and your main inheritance up to this point has been a tendency towards mild allergies and an uncanny ability to find dropped coins. So a workshop, it sounds potentially useful for storing old furniture perhaps? Your first visit is less an entry into a mystical sanctum and more an exercise in optimistic archaeology. The workshop is a small, stone-built outbuilding tucked away at the very edge of what used to be Alaric's overgrown garden. The door creaks open with a groan that suggests it hasn't been disturbed since the last plague season. Inside, the air is thick, not with magic but with generations of dust, the ghostly scent of unidentifiable chemicals, and a damp, earthy aroma that speaks of leaky roofs and benign neglect. Cobwebs hang like forgotten festive decorations, draped over everything. A single grimy window, its glass warped and clouded, allows only a few slivers of apologetic sunlight to penetrate the gloom, illuminating dancing dust motes that seem as old as time itself. The workshop doesn't so much whisper secrets of the universe as it wheezes needs a good dusting and maybe a structural engineer's report. As your eyes adjust, you begin to make out the details. Piles of books bound in cracked leather and secured with tarnished clasps are stacked precariously on rough-hewn shelves and even on the floor. Their titles, where legible, are a mixture of Latin, what might be Greek, and some symbols that look suspiciously like doodles. You spot names like Hermes Trismegistus and Geber, names that mean little to you now but carry the weight of ancient esoteric knowledge. Strange-looking glassware is everywhere, bulbous flasks with long necks, curved tubes connecting one vessel to another. Squat ceramic bowls, and an assortment of clay crucibles, many of them blackened by fire or bearing ominous cracks. An alchemist's laboratory, you're beginning to realize, is not the sleek, sterile environment of modern science. It's more like a hoarder's attic after a particularly enthusiastic but ultimately unsuccessful science fair. Dominating one corner is a brick furnace, the Athaner. Its iron door slightly ajar, revealing a cold, ash-filled interior. It looks like a medieval pizza oven that's seen better days and possibly a few minor explosions. A rickety workbench stands nearby its surface, scarred with burns, stains, and countless small indentations, testament to years of tireless, if not always fruitful labor. On it rests a mortar and pestle, a few small, oddly shaped knives, and a peculiar set of scales. Tacked to the wall is a faded parchment chart, depicting various planets' metals and what appear to be internal organs, all linked by a confusing web of lines and symbols. It's astrology meets anatomy, meets a very complicated game of connect the dots. Amidst the clutter on the workbench, you find a small leather-bound journal. This one is different from the ancient tomes. The handwriting, though spidery, is clearly your great uncle Alaric's. You blow off a layer of dust and carefully open it. The pages are filled with observations recipes and more of those cryptic symbols, but also with surprisingly personal notes. He talks of the great work, the magnum opus. He mentions the Philosopher's Stone, that legendary substance said to transmute base metals like lead into pure gold. and as a rather attractive side benefit grant eternal life, or at least a significantly extended youth. The journal mentions the Philosopher's Stone said to turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. You figure, hey, even if the eternal life part is a bit of a stretch, never having to worry about mending your own shoes or wondering where your next meal is coming from, sounds pretty good. A spark of something. Curiosity? Mild avarice. A desire to do something less predictable than, say, taking up artisanal basket weaving ignites within you. This is the humble beginning of your quest. No divine mandate, no robed mentor stroking a long white beard and intoning prophecies. Just you, a dusty inherited workshop, and the dawning realization that the path to untold riches and immortality apparently starts with a very large broom. You look around at the chaotic mess the years of accumulated grime and failed experiments. The dream of gold is a distant, shimmering possibility. The immediate reality is an overwhelming need for soap water and perhaps a sturdy pair of gloves. The great historical pursuit of alchemy, a practice that fascinated scholars, mystics, and charlatans for centuries across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and which in its own fumbling way laid some of the foundational groundwork for modern chemistry, begins for you, not with a flash of inspiration, but with a sigh and the search for a dustpan. A quirky tidbit you'll later learn is that some alchemists were so deeply convinced of the interconnectedness of the cosmos and their work that they would only undertake certain operations when the planets were in specific alignments or when they themselves were in a particular state of spiritual purity, sometimes involving prayer or fasting. Imagine trying to schedule your gold making around Mercury retrograde and a full moon, all while making sure you haven't had too many onions for lunch. Historians still debate the extent to which practicing alchemists were driven by genuine spiritual or philosophical pursuits versus the more pragmatic, if often elusive goal of Chrysopoeia. The making of gold. For you right now, the motivation is simpler. Great Uncle Alaric left a heck of a mess, and there might just be something interesting, maybe even valuable, hidden beneath it all. Time to get to work. The workshop, after a heroic battle involving you several buckets of vaguely clean water, and what felt like a small nation of spiders, is now less of a biohazard and more of a merely dusty, slightly eerie workspace. Great Uncle Alaric's journal. Your primary guide in this nascent quest for glittering riches lies open on the scarred workbench. You spend hours, days, even hunched over its brittle pages, your finger tracing the spidery script. The problem is, Alaric, like most alchemists of his era, didn't exactly write straightforward, step-by-step IKEA instructions for making gold. His notes are a delightful, or rather infuriating, mix of practical observations, philosophical musings, and wildly allegorical descriptions. Take the green lion that devours the sun, one passage advises. Another suggests combining the tears of the red dragon with the blood of the white eagle. Alaric's journal entry for what you think might be a simple cleansing solution for glassware seems to involve the dew collected from a sleeping griffin's brow at dawn filtered through the beard of a repentant king. You strongly suspect this might be a rather poetic way of saying, use rainwater and maybe some fine sand, but you can't be entirely sure. It's clear that your first task isn't mixing potions, but becoming a medieval codebreaker. Slowly, painstakingly, you begin to cross-reference Alaric's poetic flights of fancy with some of the more straightforward, a very relative term diagrams and notes in the older printed alchemical texts scattered around the workshop. The green lion you tentatively conclude might refer to vitriol, a metallic sulfate. The sun is almost certainly gold itself, though Alaric seems to be suggesting you need gold to make gold, which feels like a rather unhelpful catch-22. The red dragon's tears, possibly cinnabar or some form of mercury compound. This whole process of deciphering recipes is a key aspect of the alchemical tradition. A mainstream historical fact is that alchemists relied on a range of common and sometimes hazardous materials, including base metals like lead iron and copper, as well as mercury antimony. Various mineral salts such as alum and vitriol, and acids like sulfuric acid, often called oil of vitriol. They frequently had to prepare these substances themselves or acquire them from apothecaries, metalworkers, and other artisans. After much squinting and educated guessing, you manage to compile a sort of preliminary shopping list. It's far less glamorous than Dragon's Tears. Your list includes items like lead, lots of it, as it's the go-to base metal for transmutation attempts. iron filings, copper shavings, a good quantity of sulfur, something called sal ammoniac, ammonium chloride. You think vinegar honey, surprisingly common in alchemical recipes, often as a binding agent, or for its supposed purifying properties, and of course, an enormous amount of charcoal to feed the hungry maw of your Athenor. You also jot down a few herbs that Alaric mentioned for purification rituals, or for creating specific tinctures, though their actual alchemical utility seems dubious at best. With your list clutched in your hand, and a few meager coins in your purse, you head to the local market. This is no mystical Diagon Alley filled with enchanted shops. The medieval marketplace is a riotous, sprawling, and frankly quite fragrant assault on the senses. It smells like a medieval mystery potpourri, a heady blend of unwashed humanity, livestock chickens underfoot, a piglet making a daring escape, freshly baked bread, rotting vegetables, wood smoke, and what you sincerely hope is just a particularly pungent variety of cheese. Merchants bellow their wares, beggars plead for alms, children dart through the crowds, and the air buzzes with 1,000 conversations, arguments, and transactions. Your first stop is the apothecary. A dark, narrow stall filled with wooden drawers, dusty glass jars of dried herbs, powders, and preserved animal parts. The apothecary himself is a wizened old man with eyes that seem to miss nothing. You try to casually request items like sulfur and sal ammoniac, hoping you sound like a scholar, or perhaps a physician's apprentice. He peers at you over his spectacles, a knowing glint in his eye. "For experiments, is it?" he asks, his voice dry as old parchment. You nod vaguely, trying to appear mysterious rather than completely clueless. He charges you what feels like a king's ransom for a few small bags of lumpy yellow sulfur and some crystalline powder. Next, you seek out a metalsmith, or more realistically, a scrap dealer. You find a burly fellow with soot-stained hands presiding over a jumbled collection of discarded metal old pots, bent tools, bits of roofing lead, and rusty hinges. You try to haggle for a decent quantity of lead, attempting to look like someone who regularly purchases large amounts of scrap metal for entirely normal reasons. The vendor, a man whose face has more creases than your alchemical texts, just raises a skeptical eyebrow and names his price. You end up paying probably twice what it's worth. Your career as a shrewd negotiator is clearly off to a roaring start. The charcoal burner's stall is easier. Charcoal is a common enough commodity. Still, you have to arrange for the transport of several large dusty sacks back to your workshop. There's no medieval Amazon Prime delivering neatly packaged alchemical supplies to your door. You end up having to hire a local lad with a rickety handcart to haul your precious and surprisingly heavy acquisitions. You trudge back beside him, feeling less like a seeker of arcane secrets and more like a slightly disreputable caterer preparing for a very strange barbecue. Some alchemical recipes you recall reading with a shudder called for truly bizarre and often disgusting ingredients like powdered mummy, which disturbingly was a real trade item for a time believed to have medicinal properties or various animal urines, blood, and even dung. This reflected a mix of pre-scientific thinking, where substances were valued for symbolic associations or supposed virtues, sheer desperation, and a misunderstanding of natural processes. Thankfully, Alaric's initial shopping list seems to have spared you from that particular level of grossness for now. Back in the workshop, you survey your haul. Lumps of lead bags of powders, bundles of dried herbs, and sacks of charcoal. It all looks depressingly ordinary. There's no mystical glow, no inherent magic palpable in these mundane materials. Scholarly analysis of alchemical texts often grapples with distinguishing which described ingredients were meant literally, which were symbolic codes for other substances or processes, and which might have been deliberate obfuscations to protect trade secrets or mislead rivals. You can only hope that Alaric's green lion really is just vitriol and not an actual man-eating feline you were somehow supposed to procure from the local zoo, which you're fairly certain doesn't exist. This initial stage of gathering ingredients is certainly a lesson in humility. The grand dream of turning lead into gold, it seems, begins with the distinctly unglamorous reality of market haggling and heavy lifting. But the furnace is waiting, and your journey, however mundane its start, has truly begun. You've managed to acquire your initial batch of, let's call them artisanal ingredients, from the bustling, fragrant marketplace. Your workshop, while still retaining a certain medieval rustic charm, if by charm you mean a persistent odor of damp and mystery, is now stocked with lumpy sacks of charcoal, various unprepossessing metals, and powders of dubious purity. The next crucial step, according to Great Uncle Alaric's journal and every other alchemical text you've skimmed, involves the heart of your operation, the athanor. This is the alchemical furnace, the fiery womb, where base matter is supposedly coaxed, cajoled, and tortured into a state of perfection. Before you can even think about transmuting lead into gold, you need to master this temperamental beast. First, it needs another good cleaning. More ashes, thick layers of soot clinging to the interior walls, and a few fossilized remains of what might have been a very unfortunate insect. You peer into its structure, a firebox at the bottom, where the charcoal will burn a central chamber above that where your crucibles of precious, or currently not so precious materials will sit, and a rudimentary chimney or vent at the top, presumably to let out some of the smoke, and with any luck, the bad omens. You realize quickly this isn't like a modern oven with a convenient temperature dial and an instruction manual. This is primal technology. Gathering some dry kindling and a generous portion of your newly acquired charcoal, you begin your first attempt to bring the athanor to life. This, it turns out, is an art form in itself. Your initial efforts to light the charcoal result in an impressive amount of acrid smoke that billows out into the workshop, a few pathetic sputtering flames that die out with a mournful hiss, and the distinct smell of your own slightly singed dignity. The local fire brigade, if such an organized concept existed beyond a few neighbors with buckets, would probably just observe your efforts, shake their heads, and then quietly suggest you take up a less flammable hobby like needlepoint. Eventually, after much fanning with a piece of old leather, your rudimentary bellows is another project for another day. And a considerable expenditure of patience, you manage to get a sustainable fire going in the firebox. Now comes the real challenge: control. Alchemical texts are maddeningly vague on this point. They speak of the need for the gentle heat of a brooding hen, the moist warmth of the bath, or the fierce heat of the forge. Sometimes all required at different stages for the same concoction. But there are no medieval thermostats, no handy temperature gauges. You're relying on instinct, the color of the flames, the feel of the heat on your hand held at a hopefully safe distance, and sheer guesswork. A mainstream historical fact is that the athanor or alchemical furnace was a critical piece of equipment designed to provide sustained, controllable heat over long periods, sometimes for weeks or even months on end. This slow, steady digestion, or coction, was deemed essential for the gradual transformation of matter. You decide to start simple. Taking one of your newly purchased clay crucibles, you place a small lump of lead inside, your chosen champion, for this first round of alchemical roulette. This crucible containing your base material is sometimes referred to in text as the philosophical egg, or the hermetic vase, the sealed vessel within which the alchemical birth is supposed to occur. You carefully place it in the athanor's central chamber above the now glowing bed of charcoal. Then you wait, and watch, and feed the fire, and wait some more. The anticipation is surprisingly keen, a little thrill of what if, but mostly it's just waiting. And a lot of stirring, not of potions yet, but of the coals. Your attempts at temperature control are, shall we say, varied. Alchemical texts talk about the heat of a gentle sigh or the fury of a dragon's breath. Your athanor in these early days mostly offers lukewarm disappointment, or everything is now on actual fire. Finding that elusive sweet spot is proving remarkably tricky. On one occasion, you stoke the fire a little too enthusiastically and the heat becomes intense. You hear a faint cracking sound. Peering in cautiously, you see that your precious crucible has developed a rather alarming fissure. So much for that experiment. Another time you're too timid with the fuel, and after hours of tending a pitifully small fire, you retrieve the crucible to find the lead lump looking exactly as it did when you put it in. Only now it's slightly warmer, and if anything even more smugly lead-like. You learn that alchemy is to a large extent the art of patience, and the art of operating a good bellows. You rig up a makeshift one from some leather scraps and wooden boards, and it quickly becomes an extension of your arm, rhythmically wheezing life into the coals. Hours can pass with you doing little more than feeding charcoal, adjusting the airflow, and squinting at the crucible, trying to divine if any miraculous transformations are occurring within. The precise temperatures achieved and maintained in medieval Athenors remain a subject of some conjecture among historians of science. As contemporary alchemical descriptions of heat levels are often allegorical, the heat at which horse dung steams but does not burn, or lack precise replicable measurements, making exact modern duplication of their lengthy processes quite challenging. And safety. What safety? This is an era before safety goggles, fire retardant clothing, or fume hoods. Safety protocols in your workshop mostly consist of trying not to trip over the various bits of alchemical apparatus scattered on the floor, and hoping any noxious fumes will politely choose to exit through the leaky window rather than take up residence in your lungs. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for you. You have a few close calls with flying sparks that narrowly miss your highly flammable tunic, and your fingertips become intimately acquainted with the sensation of minor burns from accidentally touching hot tools or the furnace exterior. You quickly develop a healthy respect for the raw power of fire. Some alchemists you've read designed incredibly elaborate and ornate Athenors, sometimes with multiple interconnected chambers, or even built to resemble mythical beasts like dragons or pelicans, believing the very form and symbolism of the furnace could influence the alchemical outcome of the great work. Others, more pragmatically, just modified existing bread ovens or pottery kilns. Your own Athenor is decidedly on the modified bread oven end of the spectrum, but it's yours, and slowly, very slowly, you're starting to understand its fiery, temperamental personality. The dream of gold still seems a very long way off, but at least you can now reliably make things quite hot without usually setting the whole workshop ablaze. That, you suppose, is progress. You've wrestled with the Athenor and emerged, if not entirely victorious, then at least in a sort of smoky, begrudging truce. You can now produce a reasonably consistent heat most of the time without inadvertently summoning the local peasantry with cries of fire again. It's time to move beyond simply trying to melt lumps of lead into submission and actually start your first proper alchemical experiments. Great Uncle Alaric's journal, now slightly less cryptic, thanks to your diligent cross-referencing efforts, offers a bewildering array of recipes, or processes as he grandly calls them. You decide to start with some of the seemingly simpler ones, those that don't immediately call for ingredients like the shadow of a basilisk or the laughter of a contented bishop. The process begins at your scarred workbench. You carefully, or let's be honest, somewhat approximately, given your rudimentary measuring tools, weigh out portions of your laboriously acquired ingredients. Lead shavings go into one crucible, perhaps with a pinch of that yellow sulfur you bought from the shrewd apothecary. Copper filings are mixed with vinegar in a flask. Iron filings are combined with the crystalline sal ammoniac in another. Each ingredient is ground to a finer powder, using your trusty mortar and pestle, the rhythmic scrape and crunch, a new soundtrack to your workshop. You're like a medieval chef preparing for a dinner party where the guests are alchemical reactions, and the main course is hopefully gold. With your concoctions prepared, you carefully place them into the Athenor. The anticipation is noticeably higher now than when you were just heating plain metal. You've combined things. Surely this is where the magic happens. You settle in for the long vigil, tending the fire, observing any changes through the small peephole in the furnace door, and trying to match what you see with Alaric's often poetic descriptions of colors and fumes. And things do happen. Oh, they most certainly do. Your mixtures bubble and hiss, they fume and sputter. Sometimes they even let out little pops and bangs that make you jump. And the colors. You witness some truly spectacular transformations within your crucibles and flasks. Substances turn vivid green and alarming blood red, a profound, unsettling black, or sometimes a milky white. These color changes are a big deal in alchemical literature. They're supposed to signify key stages of the great work. For a fleeting moment, watching a dull gray sludge transform into something resembling emerald dust, you feel a thrill. This must be it. This is progress. A mainstream historical fact is that these early alchemical experiments, while consistently failing in their primary goal of chrysopoeia, did inadvertently lead to the discovery or refinement of various chemical substances and techniques. Alchemists were pioneers in distillation, sublimation, crystallization, and the preparation of certain acids like nitric and sulfuric acid mineral salts, and even some early forms of gunpowder. The visual drama is often accompanied by an equally dramatic olfactory performance. Your workshop already possessed of a certain unique bouquet, now hosts a rotating cast of truly memorable odors. There's the classic rotten egg stench of heated sulfur, the sharp, acrid tang of boiling vinegar, a curious metallic zing that tickles your nostrils, and occasionally, something so unidentifiably awful that it makes your eyes water and sends you scrambling to fling open the workshop's single protesting window. Your workshop now has a signature scent that's a heady mix of rotten eggs, burnt toast, and something vaguely like a very damp dog that's been enthusiastically rolling in questionable medieval chemicals. You're pretty sure if you manage to bottle this signature aroma, it could be marketed as a highly effective siege weapon, or at the very least, a guaranteed method for clearing out a crowded tavern in under 10 seconds. But despite all the impressive bubbling, the captivating color changes, and the aggressively pungent smells, one crucial element remains stubbornly absent: gold. No matter what you mix, no matter how carefully you control the heat, no matter how long you let it digest in the ethanol, the end result is invariably not gold. You retrieve your crucibles with a mixture of hope and trepidation, only to find them filled with dross, a brittle, glassy slag, strange-colored powders that crumble to dust at a touch, or simply slightly discolored and now rather angry-looking versions of the original metals. After one particularly smoky and pungent experiment involving lead sulfur and something Alaric vaguely termed spirit of wine, probably highly concentrated alcohol, you're left with a crucible containing a substance that looks like a burnt offering to a very, very disappointed minor deity. You sigh. At this rate, you're far more likely to accidentally invent new forms of industrial sludge or a particularly potent fertilizer than you are to produce even a single speck of gold. Frustration begins to set in. You pore over Alaric's journal again and again, convinced you must be missing some vital clue, some subtle instruction. Is it the purity of your ingredients? Are you misinterpreting the allegorical language? Is your athanor not achieving the precise, mystical sequence of temperatures required? Or perhaps, as some texts hinted, your own spiritual state isn't sufficiently pure for the great work. The interpretation of color changes in alchemical processes described in historical texts is a complex area. As modern scholars debate whether these were always literal, directly observed empirical phenomena, symbolic representations of theoretical stages in the transmutation, or quite possibly a bewildering combination of both, further complicated by the deliberate secrecy and coded language often employed in alchemical procedures. The unglamorous but utterly essential task of cleaning your glassware after each failed experiment becomes a ritual of disappointment. Some of the residues are oily and stubborn, clinging to the insides of your precious alembics, and retorts requiring vigorous scrubbing with sand and harsh lye. Occasionally, a concoction produces a rather pretty, slightly sparkly green or blue powder. For a glorious 10 seconds, your heart leaps. Could this be it, you think? Some kind of intermediate stage A proto-gold. Then it starts to smell suspiciously like mildewed socks, or you discover it's highly corrosive and eats through the cloth you try to wipe it with. Nope. Definitely not gold. A quirky or fringe tidbit from alchemical history is the practice of aurifaction, which essentially meant creating fake gold. Some less scrupulous, or perhaps just more pragmatic, alchemists became quite adept at producing substances that looked convincingly like gold, perhaps by creating golden-colored alloys like brass, or by cleverly gilding base metals. Whether this was done to defraud unsuspecting patrons to gain more funding for further research, or even as a misunderstood step towards true transmutation, is often hard to tell. It certainly blurred the lines between alchemy and early counterfeiting. For now, though, you're not even at the stage of making convincing fakes. You're firmly stuck in the lots of bubbling, very little gold phase. Pause. Each failed experiment is a small blow. But the allure of the quest, the tantalizing possibility that the next attempt will be the one, keeps you coming back to the furnace, to the workbench, to the endless hopeful stirring. Section 5. Your workshop, once a place of dusty potential, is now rapidly transforming into a museum of alchemical near misses. Cracked crucibles line a makeshift shelf like defeated soldiers. Jars filled with powders of frankly alarming hues sit in silent judgment. The unique signature scent of your experimental endeavors, that heady blend of sulfur vinegar and existential disappointment, now clings to your clothes and hair like a second skin. It's becoming abundantly clear that just randomly mixing ingredients and hoping for the best, even with the athanor, now mostly behaving itself, isn't cutting it. Your initial burst of optimistic tinkering has given way to a period of profound head-scratching. You realize that if you're ever going to get beyond producing impressively smelly sludge, you need to delve deeper into the theory, into the cryptic wisdom, supposedly locked within Great Uncle Alaric's collection of ancient texts. So you turn from the fiery embrace of the furnace to the dusty embrace of the books. The workbench is cleared of failed concoctions and becomes a scholar's desk. By the flickering light of a tallow candle or the weak gray daylight filtering through that perpetually grimy window, you spend countless hours poring over brittle foxed pages. Alaric, bless his singed old heart, was an avid collector. There are handwritten manuscripts. Their ink faded and their parchment fragile alongside early printed books with their dense black letter type. Titles like Rosarium, Philosophorum, Turba Philosophorum, and the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, or at least copies and commentaries upon it, feature prominently. These are the supposed classics of the alchemical world. Understanding them, however, is like trying to assemble flat-pack furniture with instructions written in riddles by someone who actively dislikes you. A mainstream historical fact is that alchemical texts were often deliberately highly symbolic and allegorical. They used vivid, almost poetic imagery, the Red King and White Queen often symbolizing sulfur and mercury, respectively engaging in a chemical wedding, the green lion devouring the sun, the Ouroboros, the serpent, eating its own tail. To describe substances, processes, and philosophical concepts. This was partly due to the esoteric nature of alchemy, which viewed material transformation as inextricably linked to spiritual or psychological transformation, and partly a practical measure to protect hard-won knowledge from the unworthy, or more pragmatically from thieving rivals. You encounter a bewildering bestiary of symbolic creatures and a kaleidoscope of coded colors, each supposedly holding a key to a particular stage or ingredient. The texts speak of the prima materia, the first matter, the mysterious universal substance from which all else is derived, and which you must apparently identify and purify. They detail complex sequences of operations: calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, putrefaction, coagulation. But the instructions are almost never straightforward. Take our living gold, not the common gold. One text might advise leaving you to wonder what on earth living gold is, and where you might procure it without arousing suspicion at the local market. You're starting to suspect that the serpent which devours its own tail isn't a literal instruction for your next pet acquisition, but perhaps a rather depressing metaphor for your dwindling savings going round and round into this gold-making venture. Then there's the language itself. Many of these texts are translations often from Arabic into Latin, and then perhaps paraphrased or copied by scribes, whose grasp of either language or of alchemy itself was, shall we say, less than perfect. Some of these Latin texts look like they were translated by someone whose primary language was enthusiastic gesturing, and then hastily copied down by a scribe who was clearly being paid by the smudge rather than by accuracy. Calcinate the eagle until it weeps tears of joy could, with this level of linguistic clarity, very easily mean roast the chicken thoroughly for Sunday dinner. You wrestle with obscure abbreviations, missing pages and passages, so corrupted by generations of copying errors that they descend into utter gibberish. Yet you persist. You create your own little glossary of symbols, trying to match the allegorical descriptions with the physical substances you've been working with, or with the bizarre colors and smells your experiments have produced. You make notes, draw diagrams, and compare different authors' interpretations of the same obscure passage. Sometimes a phrase or a symbol will spark a flicker of understanding, a sense of aha, only for it to be contradicted by the very next sentence or another revered authority. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights this visual and symbolic complexity is that some alchemists, particularly in the later Renaissance period, created elaborate emblem books. These were filled with incredibly surreal and allegorical illustrations, each designed to convey alchemical secrets visually, like a pre-modern, highly intellectual meme culture for those initiated into the great work. Without the key, these images are just wonderfully bizarre art. You become convinced that if you could just find the right interpretive key, the one true method to unlock the dense symbolism and the coded language, the entire grand scheme of transmutation would lay itself bare before you. Perhaps Alaric himself left such a key hidden within his notes. Or maybe it's a secret passed down through a particular school of alchemical thought. You're convinced there's a Rosetta Stone for alchemy tucked away somewhere in these dusty tomes. Either that or Great Uncle Alaric just had a really weird way of writing down his shopping list. 1 green lion, 2 measures of dragon's blood. And for heaven's sake, don't forget the eggs this time. The extent to which the deeply spiritual and religious language in many alchemical texts represented genuine devotional practice or was primarily a symbolic framework for chemical operations remains a point of ongoing discussion among historians of esotericism and science. You encounter prayers, invocations to angels, and discussions of the alchemist's own moral and spiritual purity as prerequisites for success. Is this piety, or is it part of the code, or both? Despite the frustration, despite the linguistic headaches, and the allegorical runaround, something else is happening. While you're not yet producing gold, you are almost by accident absorbing a vast amount of strange and wonderful knowledge. You're learning about the supposed properties of metals, minerals, and herbs, about the effects of acids and alkalis, about the processes of distillation and sublimation. You're becoming a reluctant scholar of metallurgy, botany, early chemistry, mythology, and philosophy, all rolled into one. Your quest for material riches is slowly, subtly turning into an intellectual journey. Though your landlord, you suspect, would still prefer, you just found some actual gold to pay the rent. The flickering candlelight in your dusty workshop has become your constant companion as you wade deeper and deeper into the murky depths of alchemical literature. Your brain feels like it's been pickled in allegories and marinated in bad Latin. Yet amidst the poetic ramblings about green lions and philosophical eagles, a particular substance keeps shimmering to the forefront of your attention: mercury, or quicksilver as it's often called. Countless texts, from the most ancient authorities to Great Uncle Alaric's own spidery notes, seem to highlight its paramount importance. It's often paired with sulfur, like the primordial parents, the mother and father, from which all other metals are supposedly born. Mercury is described as the spirit of metals, the feminine principle, the watery, volatile essence that needs to be fixed and perfected. A mainstream historical fact is that mercury quicksilver was absolutely central to alchemical theory and practice across diverse cultures from ancient China and India to the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Its unique ability to dissolve other metals, forming amalgams, and its liquid silvery nature made it seem almost alive, a truly magical substance. This feels like a significant clue, a potential breakthrough in your frustratingly gold-free quest. If mercury is so fundamental, then perhaps your previous experiments failed because you lacked this key ingredient or didn't understand its proper application. A new obsession begins to take root. You must obtain mercury. This, however, proves to be a more challenging and expensive proposition than acquiring lumps of lead or bags of sulfur. Quicksilver isn't something you can just pick up from the local ironmonger. You make discreet inquiries. The apothecary who sold you the sulfur gives you a long appraising look when you mention it, quotes a price that makes your ears ring, and informs you he might be able to procure a small amount for a trusted client, of course. Alternatively, some texts hint at preparing it yourself from its common ore cinnabar, a reddish stone. This process typically involves roasting the cinnabar, a procedure you vaguely understand releases the mercury as a vapor, which must then be condensed. Even with your limited knowledge, this sounds like a particularly noxious and probably quite dangerous undertaking. After parting with a significant portion of your remaining funds, you manage to acquire a small heavy stone flask of the precious liquid metal. The first time you pour a little into a dish, you're mesmerized. It's beautiful like liquid moonlight. It quivers and rolls, splitting into smaller spheres that then eagerly coalesce back into a single shimmering pool. It coats your stirring rod with a silvery sheen, then drips off cleanly. Mercury is like the supermodel of the elemental world. Shiny, alluring, a bit volatile, and probably not something you want to get too close to for extended periods without proper precautions. Which, of course, given this is the medieval period, and your workshop is essentially a drafty shed, you absolutely do not have. Your experiments take on a new intensity. You carefully combine mercury with lead with copper, even with a tiny hoarded silver coin you probably should have used to buy food. You heat these amalgams in your athanor, watching intently. Sometimes the results are visually striking. You heat a dull copper coin coated in mercury, and lo and behold, it comes out looking brightly, dazzlingly silvery. For a heart-stopping moment, you think you've achieved the lesser work, the transmutation into silver, which many alchemists believed was a crucial step on the path to gold. Then, after a few days, the silvery coating starts to dull, or you realize it's just that, a coating. You've essentially just made a slightly more toxic copper coin. Still progressive a sort. Maybe you can try to sell it as enchanted currency to any particularly gullible pilgrims passing through town. The unique nature of mercury leads you down the amalgamation path of alchemy. The theory, as you understand it, is that by dissolving a base metal in mercury, you are somehow cleansing it, stripping away its impurities. The mercury acts as a kind of solvent abath that washes away the dross. The next much trickier step is to then somehow fix the mercury to solidify its volatile spirit and combine it permanently with the purified metal, hopefully elevating it to a more noble state. Whether the alchemical concept of philosophical mercury referred solely to common quicksilver, or to a more purified, idealized, or even entirely esoteric form of it, is a matter of ongoing interpretation among scholars of alchemical symbolism. Some texts imply that the mercury itself needs to undergo several stages of purification before it can be used in the great work, becoming a kind of super mercury, the true prima materia. Working with this potent, almost living substance makes you even more secretive about your activities. The risks feel higher now. Not just the risk of failure, but perhaps of attracting unwanted attention. If word got out you were dabbling with such a powerful and expensive material, your workshop door is barred more firmly at night. You find yourself glancing over your shoulder more often. And then there are the hazards insidious and largely unrecognized. When you heat mercury or its amalgams, it releases invisible, odorless vapors. Your workshop now occasionally features a faint silvery mist, especially noticeable when a stray sunbeam pierces the gloom after you've been working with the Athener at high heat. You think it adds a certain mystical ambiance to the place. Future neurologists, however, and indeed anyone with a basic grasp of toxicology, might have a rather different and far more alarming opinion on your ambient heavy metal aromatherapy sessions. You might notice a persistent metallic taste in your mouth, or that your hands tremble slightly more than they used to after a long day of grinding materials. Perhaps you suffer from more frequent headaches, but these are subtle symptoms easily dismissed as fatigue, from long hours, the fumes from the charcoal, or just the general miasma of medieval urban living. The profound long-term dangers of mercury poisoning, madness, organ failure, are utterly unknown to you. You are, after all, a pioneer on the very fuzzy border of science and magic, and safety regulations haven't been invented yet. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might stumble upon in your readings is the belief held by some alchemists that the origin and preparation of mercury mattered immensely. They believed that mercury sourced from different geographical locations, or mercury that was extracted from its ore, usually cinnabar, under specific astrological conjunctions, possessed different virtues or potencies essential for the great work. This isn't just any ordinary quicksilver, my friend. You can imagine a particularly earnest alchemist confiding, "This is special mercury gathered from the seventh vein of the forgotten mine located beneath the tallest mountain, precisely when Jupiter was ascendant in Leo and smiling benevolently upon the endeavor." Such beliefs highlight the blend of empirical observation and mystical thinking that characterized alchemy. For now, your own mercury procured at great expense from the slightly shifty apothecary will have to do. Its silvery allure has captivated you, and you feel with a renewed, if somewhat perilous enthusiasm, that you are finally on the right track, even if that track is paved with shimmering toxic droplets. Your recent, rather slippery obsession with mercury has yielded some fascinating, if not particularly golden, results. The shimmering allure of quicksilver, its ability to coat base metals and make them gleam with a temporary deceitful nobility, has certainly been captivating. But as you delve further into Great Uncle Alaric's texts and cross-reference them with other venerable and equally confusing alchemical authorities, you realize that mercury, for all its glamour, is only one half of a crucial partnership. The ancient wisdom consistently speaks of two primordial parents from which all metals are supposedly born. If mercury is the volatile feminine spirit, then its indispensable counterpart, the body, or the fixed masculine principle, is almost invariably identified as sulfur. You recall the concept of the chemical wedding, the sacred union of the Red King, often sulfur, and the White Queen Mercury. A mystical marriage that is said to be essential for the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. A mainstream historical fact is that sulfur was considered alongside mercury one of the two primary principles in the classical alchemical theory of metals, a theory that held sway for centuries. Alchemists believed that all metals were formed from different proportions and purities of these two parents, with gold being the most perfect and balanced union. So, with a renewed sense of purpose, you turn your attention to the lumpy yellow substance you'd somewhat neglected during your mercurial phase. You might need more of it now, or perhaps different forms. The texts are, as usual, annoyingly vague sometimes, speaking of common brimstone, and other times hinting at a more refined, philosophical sulfur. You eye your existing stock procured from that sharp-eyed apothecary and wonder if its pedestrian origins are holding you back. Is this sulfur pure enough? Is it the right kind of sulfur? The texts mention our sulfur, which is not the common sulfur. You look at your bag of decidedly common lumpy yellow stuff and sigh. It's like trying to bake a gourmet cake when the recipe calls for the distilled essence of a phoenix tear, and all you have in the pantry is regular table salt. Nevertheless, you press on with what you have. The core of your new experiments revolves around combining sulfur and mercury in various ways, often with the addition of other metals you're trying to transmute. This pairing is a cornerstone of alchemical practice. You carefully grind the brittle yellow sulfur into a fine powder using your mortar and pestle. You then mix it with the shimmering heavy quicksilver, a process that feels inherently strange, combining a dry powder with a liquid metal. Sometimes you heat them gently together in a sealed flask, other times more vigorously in a crucible within the ever-hungry Athenor. The reactions are often dramatic, and to put it mildly, incredibly pungent. When sulfur is heated, especially in the presence of metals and other reactive substances, it tends to produce copious fumes and some truly memorable smells. The classic rotten egg aroma of hydrogen sulfide is often present, but when sulfur burns, it creates sulfur dioxide, a sharp choking and intensely irritating gas. Your workshop, which previously boasted a merely unique olfactory signature, now graduates to a level of atmospheric intensity that could probably deter invading armies. Your workshop now smells so intensely of sulfur that you suspect the local pigeons are actively rerouting their flight paths to avoid your chimney and any passing demons. Rather than feeling summoned, probably just wrinkle their noses and think you're desperately trying to fumigate for an emphae or an infestation of particularly stubborn good intentions. You're seriously considering putting up a sign, "Beware of the alchemist and his singular all-encompassing stench." One of the key goals in these sulfur-mercury experiments is to fix the mercury. The idea is that sulfur, being more fixed and earthy in its nature, can help to stabilize the volatile spirit of mercury, giving it body and color. Alchemists believed that by successfully combining these two principles in the correct proportions and under the right conditions, they could create a stable red substance, often referred to as artificial cinnabar or vermilion, if the process is successful in producing the pigment. This red stage, the rubido, is considered a crucial step towards achieving the final gold-making stone. You're trying to get sulfur and mercury to have their chemical wedding. Nanipadak. So far, many of your attempts feel less like a harmonious romantic union and more like a very smelly, occasionally explosive argument happening inside a sealed pot. Clearly, elemental relationship counseling is not yet one of your developed alchemical skills. You observe a fascinating array of transformations. Sometimes the mixture will turn a deep, unsettling black, the negrido, or blackening another important alchemical stage. Other times, if you get the proportions and heat just right, you might indeed produce a vibrant red powder. This is exciting. Red is good. Red is the color of gold, the color of perfection, the color of the stone itself in some descriptions. However, this red powder, while visually promising, still stubbornly refuses to transmute anything into gold. It might be useful as a pigment if you were artistically inclined, but it's not making you rich. Historians of chemistry continue to explore whether the alchemical sulfur-mercury theory was purely a philosophical construct, or if it also reflected early empirical observations about the properties of metallic ores, many of which are indeed sulfides like pyrite fool's gold, which is iron sulfide, and the behavior of metals when heated with sulfur. It's possible that ancient metallurgists observing how metals could be extracted from sulfur-containing ores, or how metals changed when heated with sulfur, developed this theory to explain these transformations. You read about alchemists seeking out specific types of sulfur. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the belief among some practitioners that sulfur found near volcanoes was particularly potent. They reasoned that volcanoes were like nature's giant athanors, places where sulfur and mercury combined under immense heat and pressure deep within the earth to form metals. Therefore, volcanic brimstone already cooked by nature's fire was considered to be imbued with special virtues. You briefly entertain the idea of a field trip to the nearest active volcano, then remember the state of your finances and the general impracticality of such an expedition, and decide to make do with your apothecary-grade sulfur for now. Each experiment, even the failures, teaches you something. Even if it's just another way not to make gold or another new and exciting way to make your workshop smell truly diabolical. The path to perfection, it seems, is paved with patience, perseverance, and an ever-increasing tolerance for really, really bad smells. The embrace of sulfur is a stinky one, but you endure it driven by the ancient promise that within this fiery odoriferous element lies one of the essential keys to the great work. The air in your workshop is thick enough to spread on toast, a rich tapestry woven from the ghosts of burnt sulfur, the metallic tang of your mercury experiments, and the general underlying aroma of ancient dust and damp stone. Your quest to marry sulfur and mercury while producing some impressively offensive smells in a range of colorful but resolutely non-golden powders has mostly resulted in complex, sludgy mixtures. It's becoming increasingly clear as you once again consult Great Uncle Alaric's wisdom and the wisdom of his even dustier predecessors that simple mixing and heating isn't enough. The texts are full of injunctions to separate the subtle from the gross, to purify the spirits, and to wash away the dross. And the primary method for achieving this separation, this purification, seems to be the ancient and rather fiddly art of distillation. You turn your attention to the array of bizarre glassware that has, until now, mostly served as decorative dust catchers or homes for particularly adventurous spiders. The key pieces for distillation, you learn, are the cucurbit A-round or pear-shaped flask where the initial liquid is heated, the alembic, a still head that fits over the cucurbit with a downward-pointing beak or tube for the condensed vapors to run off, and a receiving flask to collect the precious distillate. Your collection of glassware is starting to look like it's been through a very clumsy medieval jousting tournament, followed by a minor earthquake. You treat each surviving uncracked alembic with the kind of reverence usually reserved for major holy relics, or at least a really, really good cheese. This stuff is fragile, expensive, and not easily replaced. A mainstream historical fact is that distillation was a crucial chemical technique significantly developed and utilized by alchemists, particularly those following the Jabrian corpus in the Islamic Golden Age, and later by their European counterparts. They used it for a wide range of purposes, including purifying substances, separating mixtures, preparing potent acids, and very importantly, producing alcohol, the coveted spirit of wine, from wine itself. Spirit of wine was considered a powerful solvent and a key ingredient in many alchemical processes believed to be capable of extracting the essence or virtue from other materials. Your first forays into distillation are predictably fraught with minor disasters. The process involves heating your chosen liquid, perhaps some cheap wine, to try and get that spirit of wine, or one of your less successful alchemical soups, gently in the cucurbit, which sits snugly in a sand bath over a low flame on your athanor. The idea is that the more volatile components will rise into the alembic head, and then as they encounter the cooler surface of the alembic's beak, which you might drape with damp cloths to aid condensation, they will condense back into liquid and drip, drip, drip into your receiving flask. The efficiency and precise nature of early alchemical condensers are subjects of active discussion among historians of science and technology. While some designs were remarkably sophisticated for their time, many were quite rudimentary, leading scholars to debate how effectively alchemists could truly separate liquids with very close boiling points using only their available apparatus. Controlling the heat is paramount. Too much and your mixture boils over violently, a bubbling, hissing eruption that threatens to crack your precious glassware, or at the very least make an appalling mess. Too little and nothing happens at all, except you waste a lot of charcoal and patience. You quickly learn the heartbreak of hearing that telltale tink sound that signals a piece of glassware stressed by sudden temperature change has just developed a fatal crack, sending your potentially valuable, or at least interestingly smelly concoction leaking all over the hot sand bath. Each such failure is a small tragedy and a significant dent in your dwindling finances. You try distilling various things, you take some of the dark, murky liquid left over from a sulfur, and lead experiment hoping to extract its hidden spirit. After hours of careful heating and watching the slow, rhythmic drip into the receiver, you manage to collect a small amount of a surprisingly clear, watery liquid. Success until you smell it. You manage to distill this clear liquid, and it looks like pure water. But it smells like the ghost of 1,000 rotten eggs has decided to take up permanent residence in your sinuses and throw a very pungent housewarming party. You thoughtfully label it Essence of Acute Nasal Disappointment and place it on a high shelf far away from anything flammable or indeed living. You also attempt to make purified water by distilling regular well water, as many texts call for this as a base for other operations. This is less dramatic, but highlights the sheer tedium of the process. Watching the distillation is akin to watching particularly slow and slightly damp paint dry if the paint was also actively trying to explode due to thermal stress and smelled faintly of despair. Drip. 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 Each drop feels like a tiny victory against impatience. You seriously consider taking up knitting or perhaps competitive staring at a wall, just to have something marginally more exciting to do while you wait. Yet amidst the frustrations and the overpowering fumes, there are small triumphs. You successfully distill some wine and obtain a small quantity of a flammable liquid that is undoubtedly the spirit of wine the texts speak of. It has a sharp, clean smell, compared to the workshop's usual miasma, and it burns with a pale blue flame. This feels like genuine progress. You are mastering a technique, a fundamental alchemical operation. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some alchemists designed incredibly elaborate distillation apparatus, such as the pelican, a type of circulatory still where the alembic's beak curved back down into the cucurbit. This allowed the condensed vapors to flow directly back into the boiling flask, creating a continuous reflux action. This was often seen as symbolic of the Ouroboros the serpent eating its own tail, representing the cyclical nature of the great work and the idea of continuous purification. Your workshop is now adorned with an increasing number of flasks and bottles containing various distillates, some clear, some faintly colored, many of them possessing smells that defy polite description. You are separating the gross from the grosser, one painstaking drop at a time. Gold remains stubbornly elusive, but your understanding of the materials and processes of this strange art is slowly, undeniably deepening. You are becoming, if not a maker of gold, then at least a connoisseur of very peculiar liquids. Your workshop is now a testament to your relentless, if not always successful efforts in the art of distillation. Rows of flasks contain liquids of varying clarity and pungency, each representing hours of patient observation and careful heat management. You've separated the subtle from the gross more times than you can count, though often the subtle turns out to be just as baffling as the gross. Having wrestled with the practicalities of individual ingredients like mercury and sulfur, and mastered some fundamental techniques, you find yourself drawn back to Great Uncle Alaric's library seeking a broader understanding, a map for this increasingly complex journey. You're starting to suspect that alchemy isn't just about finding the right recipe, but about following a specific, arduous path. As you delve deeper into the more philosophical, alchemical texts, a recurring concept begins to emerge. The great work, the magnum opus, is not a single event, but a sequence of distinct stages. A mainstream historical fact is that many alchemical traditions across various cultures and time periods describe the process of transmutation as unfolding in a defined series of operations, or stages. These stages were often associated with specific color changes observed in the alchemical matter, most famously blackness, negredo whiteness, albedo, and redness rubedo, and were believed to represent not only chemical transformations, but also allegorical phases of spiritual development for the alchemist. The exact number and names of these stages can vary frustratingly from one authority to another. Some texts speak of 3 primary phases, others 4, a common tradition outlines 7, and some particularly ambitious or convoluted authors describe 12 or even more. However, you start to recognize common themes and operations. Names like calcination, a burning or breaking down of the initial matter. Dissolution, dissolving it in a solvent. Often your hard-won spirit of wine or a specially prepared acid separation. More distillation and filtering to isolate the desired components. And conjunction, the recombining of purified elements like the chemical wedding of your sulfur and mercury, appear with reassuring, if still somewhat opaque regularity. Then come further stages like fermentation, introducing a leaven to vivify the matter more. Distillation to further purify and elevate the substance, and finally, coagulation, the solidification of the purified essence into the philosopher's stone itself. Suddenly, some of your past experiments, even the spectacular failures, begin to take on a new, albeit retroactive significance. That time you overheated a mixture of lead and sulfur until it became a brittle black ash. Perhaps that was an unintended but nonetheless authentic calcination, or the negredo stage. The strange milky white substance you once produced after washing a metallic residue multiple times. Could that have been a fleeting glimpse of albedo? So that time your most promising concoction unexpectedly bubbled over, redecorated a significant portion of the ceiling, and made the workshop cat sneeze vibrant blue for 3 days straight. That wasn't a catastrophic failure, no, that was clearly an undocumented, highly advanced subphase of spontaneous chromatic dispersal. You're practically an alchemical innovator, just in ways you hadn't quite intended. This new understanding of a structured multi-stage process brings with it a rather sobering realization. Alchemy, it turns out, is definitively not a get-rich-quick scheme. You read about the 7 or 12 or however many this particular author fancies stages of the great work, each potentially requiring months, even years of meticulous patient labor, of carefully controlled heating in the ethanol of endless cycles of dissolving, purifying, and recombining. Suddenly, your initial, rather hopeful plan to be fabulously wealthy with gold by next Tuesday seems a tad optimistic. It's looking more like hopefully not still smelling faintly of burnt sulfur and regret by the time the next comet comes around. This is a life's work, a marathon of stirring and squinting, not a sprint to the bank. Each stage you learn is not just a chemical operation, but is also rich with symbolism. Negredo, the blackening, is often associated with death putrefaction, the descent into darkness, but also the necessary decomposition of the old to make way for the new. Albedo, the whitening, symbolizes purification, enlightenment, the washing away of impurities. And rubedo, the reddening, represents the dawn, the culmination, the achievement of perfection, the fiery birth of the stone. These stages are often linked to planets' metals and even specific psychological or spiritual transformations that the alchemist, him or herself, must undergo. Some texts strongly imply that the alchemist must be as pure and transformed as the materials they work with. You glance down at your grimy, soot-stained tunic. Consider the dubious state of your personal hygiene after a week of non-stop furnace duty and wrestling with leaky alembics, and think, well, if spiritual purity is a prerequisite, we might have identified bottleneck number 1 right there. The consistency and universality of the stages across different alchemical texts and traditions are subject to scholarly debate, with some historians arguing for a core underlying structure common to most systems, while others emphasize significant regional variations, philosophical differences, and the highly idiosyncratic interpretations of the process by individual practitioners. You certainly see this in Alaric's collection. One author's 7 stages look quite different from another's 4. Some alchemists you discover from a quirky tidbit in a margin note kept incredibly detailed lab diaries. In these, they didn't just record their experimental procedures and observations of color changes or precipitates. They also meticulously documented their dreams, visions, prayers, and spiritual reflections, believing these inner experiences were as integral to the progress of the great work as the external manipulations in the laboratory. It was a truly holistic, if somewhat exhausting approach, like journaling your way to enlightenment, and with any luck, a mountain of gold. The sheer scale of the magnum opus, as you now begin to perceive it, is daunting. It feels like being at the foot of an enormous, mist-shrouded mountain. Yet this emerging theoretical framework, this long and winding road of stages, also offers a strange kind of comfort. It provides a map, however cryptic and contested, where before there was only bewildered wandering. Your random acts of mixing and heating now have potential context, The journey is far longer and more arduous than you ever imagined. But for the first time, you have a sense, however faint, of the path ahead. The grand unfolding map of the 7 or so stages of the great work has given you a new, albeit daunting, perspective on your alchemical quest. It's a long, winding road indeed, and the initial naive dream of quick riches has long since evaporated, much like an unstoppered flask of spirit of wine left in the sun. As you continue to reconcile your practical experiments with the dense theories in Great Uncle Alaric's books, you start to notice that while mercury, the spirit, and sulfur, the soul, are consistently lauded as the two primary principles, some texts, particularly those from later periods or influenced by figures like Paracelsus, introduce a third essential component, salt. A mainstream historical fact is that in later European alchemy, particularly from the Renaissance onwards, salt sal was often posited alongside sulfur and mercury as one of the tria prima, or 3 primary principles from which all things were composed. Salt was seen to represent the principle of fixity, incombustibility, and the physical body that remained after the more volatile spirit and soul had been driven off or purified. This concept of salt isn't necessarily just about the common stuff you'd sprinkle on your porridge, though. Ordinary sodium chloride certainly has its place in alchemical recipes often used for purification or in creating specific saline baths. In alchemical philosophy, salt can refer to a much broader category of substances. It can mean various mineral salts like alum vitriol sulfates, of various metals or sal ammoniac ammonium chloride, many of which you've already encountered and used perhaps without fully appreciating their theoretical significance. It can also refer to alkalis like potash painstakingly leached from wood ashes, or even the solid, often crystalline residue left behind after a substance has undergone calcination or been thoroughly burned in the athanor. It is the principle of earth of physical manifestation, the stable matrix that gives form and substance to the more ethereal principles of mercury and sulfur. So after all the high drama of working with shimmering elusive mercury and the intensely fragrant, sometimes explosive character of sulfur, it turns out another key ingredient to this cosmic puzzle is salt. It feels a bit like finally discovering the profound secret to eternal youth and boundless energy is just consistently eating your vegetables and getting a good night's sleep. Unexciting perhaps compared to wrestling with dragons or conversing with angels, but fundamentally essential. You begin to pay more attention to these less glamorous, often dull-looking crystalline powders and residues. You realize that salts play a multitude of practical roles in your workshop. Some act as powerful fluxes when you're trying to smelt ores or melt metals. They help the materials flow better at lower temperatures and can assist in separating out impurities, forming a slag that can be skimmed off. You've seen this happen perhaps unknowingly when a mixture in a crucible became more fluid, or when glassy residues formed. Other salts, when dissolved in water, create solutions that can act as potent solvents themselves, or react vigorously with metals producing those vivid color changes, or interesting precipitates you've occasionally managed to create. That bright green powder you got from treating copper with vinegar and sal ammoniac, a copper salt. The various vitriols, blue for copper, green for iron, white for zinc, are all metallic salts, each with its own character and uses. The precise chemical identity of philosophical salt in many alchemical writings is often quite ambiguous, with modern scholars and historians of chemistry frequently debating whether it referred to a specific identifiable chemical compound, a general class of such compounds, or perhaps a more abstract symbolic principle of material stability and form. With this new appreciation, you revisit some of your earlier experiments and the various byproducts you'd previously dismissed as mere dross or waste. You used to just sigh and chuck out that boring white or grayish powder left crusted at the bottom of a crucible after a particularly enthusiastic session with the athanor. Now you peer at it thoughtfully, turning it over with a spatula. Could this be the crucial salfixum, the very body of the metal purified by fire? More often than not, it's probably just a disappointing collection of burnt gunk and crucible scrapings, but hey, an alchemist can dream, can't they? You also realize you might need to prepare some of these salts yourself. Potash, for example. An important alkali is traditionally made by elixivation, a wonderfully medieval-sounding word that basically means leaching wood ashes with water and then evaporating the resulting solution to get the salt. You spend a rather laborious week gathering wood ash as your neighbors are starting to view your increasingly strange request with deep suspicion, boiling them down in a large iron pot over an outdoor fire, filtering the murky liquid and then gently evaporating it. Your hands are raw from handling ashes and stirring the caustic solution. You smell like a particularly well-smoked kipper, and the final yield of grayish-white powder is disappointingly tiny. You're starting to think the noble alchemical title, Salt of the Earth, is less a descriptor of profound wisdom and incorruptibility, and more an accurate summary of what's now permanently embedded under your fingernails and in the lines on your palms. Some alchemists you read in a quirky passage became quite adept at crystallomancy, a form of divination, where they would interpret the shapes, colors, and clarity of the crystals, often various salts, that formed during their experiments. They believed these crystalline structures offered divine clues to the success or failure of a particular operation, or pointed toward the next step in the great work. Ooh, look at that perfectly formed hexagonal crystal of nitre. The cosmos clearly approves of my potash purification process and is subtly hinting at a trip to the tavern. The incorporation of salt into your alchemical worldview, as the third principle, the body that grounds the spirit of mercury and the soul of sulfur, adds another layer of complexity, but also a deeper sense of completeness to the theoretical framework. It reinforces the growing understanding that this quest is not just about flashy, glittering results. Not all that glitters is gold, you're learning, but some things that don't glitter at all, like a humble pile of unassuming gray salt, can be surprisingly useful, even essential in this long and remarkably dusty path to perfection. Armed with your newfound appreciation for the humble yet crucial role of salt, and a clearer, if still rather daunting, understanding of the sequential stages of the great work, you feel a renewed, if somewhat wary sense of purpose. The haphazard mixing and hopeful heating of your early days has given way to a more focused, albeit still profoundly experimental approach. It's time you decide to deliberately tackle the first great mountain of the alchemical opus, the nigredo, the blackening. The texts are unanimous: before any creation there must be destruction. Before purification, there must be putrefaction. The prima materia, your carefully chosen blend of ingredients, must die and decay to release its hidden inner potential. Nigredo, as described in Great Uncle Alaric's books and countless other venerable sources, is the stage of utter darkness, of chaos, of the blacker than black. It's often associated with the crow, the raven, the toad, creatures of the dark and the earth. It is the alchemical equivalent of winter, where all life seems to recede only to re-emerge transformed in the spring. A mainstream historical fact is that nigredo, or the blackening, was widely considered the first major and indispensable stage of the alchemical magnum opus. It represented the decomposition of the initial materials, a necessary death before rebirth and purification. Albedo could occur, often symbolically linked with the element earth. The metal lead, or the planet Saturn, the bringer of melancholy and limitations. Your practical attempts to induce nigredo involve carefully preparing your philosophical egg. This isn't a literal egg, but rather a sealed vessel, typically a sturdy glass flask with a rounded bottom, a cucurbit well luted to an alembic head, or a specially designed hermetically sealed flask containing your chosen ingredients. You might combine your painstakingly purified mercury, your most promising sulfur, and perhaps a portion of lead, or another base metal, all ground finely and intimately mixed, possibly with a dash of that special salt you've been cultivating. This sealed vessel is then placed into your athanor, not for a fierce roaring fire, but for a long, slow, gentle heat. The heat of a brooding hen, as the texts poetically describe it, or sometimes the heat of a dung bath. This latter phrase might refer to literally burying the flask in a pile of decomposing horse manure, which generates a steady low warmth. Or it could be an allegorical way of describing a very mild, moist heat. Given the state of your workshop's aroma, you figure you're halfway to a dung bath, metaphorically speaking anyway. The goal is for the mixture within the sealed flask to slowly, over weeks or even months, transform into a uniform, deep, and absolute black. Your current experiment is aiming for blacker than the blackest black times infinity. A shade so profound, it makes a moonless midnight look like a sunny afternoon. Right now, after several days of gentle warming, the contents of your flask look less like cosmic primordial chaos, and more like something a very unwell crow might have coughed up after a particularly regrettable meal. It's a sludgy, unappealing grayish-brown, and it's definitely not winning any beauty pageants, this proto-Negredo. And then there's the smell. Oh, the smell. If you thought your workshop was fragrant before Negredo takes olfactory unpleasantness to an entirely new, almost artistic level. Putrefaction, by its very definition, implies decomposition. Even if your ingredients are purely mineral, the allegorical language of death and decay is potent, and some alchemists took this quite literally. A quirky or fringe tidbit you've encountered in your readings is that some practitioners, in their zeal to achieve a thorough Negredo, deliberately incorporated substances like actual manure, urine, blood, or even decaying flesh into their initial mixtures. They believed these organic ferments would hasten the decomposition or provide some vital, if disgusting, life force to the process. While you haven't quite stooped to raiding the local charnel house for ingredients, the slow, subtle chemical changes occurring within your flask under gentle heat can still release some truly breathtakingly awful odors. The workshop now has an aroma that could probably knock a buzzard off a carry-on wagon at 50 paces. You're fairly certain you saw in a rat previously a stoic resident of your workshop packing its tiny bags and leaving a very small, very indignant note on the doorstep earlier. Even the usually unflappable spiders in the corners are looking a bit green around the gills. The duration and specific visual or olfactory markers of a successful Negredo are often ambiguously described in alchemical texts, leading to considerable scholarly discussion on whether these descriptions were intended as standardized empirical observations that any practitioner should expect, or if they were more personalized allegorical interpretations of the subtle chemical changes occurring, perhaps even reflecting the alchemist's own psychological state. Is your current batch of stinking gray gunk a failed attempt, or just a very, very slow starter on its journey to true blackness? The uncertainty is maddening. This stage is not just a trial for the materials. It's a profound test of your resolve, your patience, and quite frankly, your gag reflex. The texts say Negredo tests the alchemist's faith and perseverance. Right now, it's mainly testing your ability to keep your lunch down on a consistent basis, and perhaps more urgently, your neighbor's ability to refrain from forming an angry mob equipped with pitchforks, torches, and very large medieval-era air fresheners. The lack of any aesthetically pleasing results, the sheer ugliness and foulness of the process can be deeply disheartening. It's easy to feel like you're just making increasingly elaborate and expensive mud pies. Day after day, week after week, you tend the athanor, ensuring the heat remains gentle and constant. You peer into the flask, noting any subtle shifts in color or consistency. The mixture might separate into oily layers, develop strange crystalline growths, or bubble sluggishly before hopefully gradually darkening further. You record everything meticulously in your journal, just like Great Uncle Alaric did, noting the date, the appearance of the matter. The smell's described with a thesaurus of unpleasantness and any dreams or strange thoughts you might have, just in case they're relevant. The alchemical path to enlightenment, it seems, winds its way through some very dark, very smelly, and decidedly unglamorous valleys. But if the ancient masters are to be believed, this descent into blackness is the essential first step towards the shimmering promise of gold. The oppressive reign of Negredo, with its Stygian blackness and soul-scouring stenches, has tested the very limits of your alchemical faith and your ability to tolerate truly monumental bad smells. For weeks, possibly months, you have patiently tended the gentle flame beneath your philosophical egg, watching the contents slowly transform into something resembling primordial sludge blessed by the god of utter darkness. The air in your workshop has been thick enough to chew, and your neighbors have developed a new, very respectful distance. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, a change begins. The ancient text, your only comfort during the long, dark vigil of Negredo, promise this. If the initial stage of death and decomposition has been successfully navigated, the matter will begin to shed its blackness. This, they say, is the dawn of albedo, the whitening. A mainstream historical fact is that albedo, or the whitening, is traditionally recognized as the second major stage of the alchemical magnum opus, emerging directly from the successful completion of Negredo. It signifies a crucial phase of purification and ablution, where the dead matter from the black stage is symbolically washed, revived, and cleansed of its impurities. This transformation is often represented by imagery of the white dove, the swan, the full moon, or the white queen. After weeks of staring into a flask of what looked like congealed despair, seeing the first subtle lightening of that inky mass, is like spotting a mythical creature performing an unlikely dance on a beam of pure sunlight. You blink several times, lean closer, and wonder if your eyes, or perhaps your entire sanity, are finally succumbing to the relentless assault of mystery fumes and existential angst. The process of achieving albedo often involves a washing of the black matter. This isn't always a literal washing with water, though sometimes it is, using your carefully distilled, purified water or spirit of wine to cleanse the residue. More often, it's an allegorical washing achieved through continued, carefully controlled heating. You might gradually increase the temperature in your athanor a notch above the gentle, brooding hen heat of Negredo. This encourages the sublimation of any remaining volatile impurities, which rise up and might condense on the cooler parts of your alembic, leaving behind a progressively whiter substance in the cucurbit. Multiple distillations or sublimations might be required, each one a patient coaxing of the matter towards a state of perfect, luminous whiteness. The sensory details of albedo are a stark and welcome contrast to the grimness of its predecessor. Visually, the transformation is profound. The tarry, sooty, or muddy blackness of Negredo slowly gives way. It might pass through shades of gray, or sometimes as a transitional phase display, i.e. a shimmering iridescence like oil on water or a peacock's tail, a hopeful sign that the darkness is breaking. Eventually, with continued work and not a small amount of luck, the matter in your flask should achieve a brilliant, pure, almost dazzling whiteness. The texts compare it to fresh, snow-polished silver or the purest white marble. The smell, too, undergoes a blessed transformation. The foul, putrid odors that characterize Negredo should gradually dissipate. The air in your workshop has upgraded from actively trying to dissolve your lungs and possibly melt steel, to merely aggressively uninteresting, or perhaps even possessing a faint, clean, almost chalky aroma. You'll take it. It's like your long-suffering nose has been on a very arduous, very dark, and exceptionally smelly holiday and is finally seeing a glimmer of bland, blessedly odorless daylight. The texture of this new white matter can vary. It might be a fine, soft powder, a collection of delicate crystals, or a smooth, waxy, almost soap-like solid. Scholars continue to debate the exact chemical processes that alchemists might have been observing or inducing to achieve the albedo stage, with theories ranging from the careful purification of metallic chlorides or oxides to specific crystallizations of salts or controlled sublimations that resulted in a distinctly white and often highly purified substance. Whatever the precise chemistry, the psychological impact on you, the alchemist is immense. After the despair, doubt, and sheer disgust of the Negredo, witnessing the emergence of albedo feels like a resurrection. It's a tangible sign that the great work is progressing, that your patient endurance through the darkness has not been in vain. Hope, which had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember, now flares up with renewed vigor. The stark, clean beauty of the white substance is aesthetically pleasing and deeply encouraging. This feeling of purification might even inspire you to tackle the mundane chaos of your surroundings. Inspired by the gleaming, almost holy whiteness now residing in your precious flask, you might suddenly look around at the accumulated grime, the soot-stained benches, and the general medieval squalor of your workshop with fresh eyes. Perhaps you decide to give the place a thorough cleaning. An hour or two of vigorous sweeping, scrubbing, and reorganizing later, you might have uncovered 3 missing alembic stands, a very surprised and dusty mouse who seems to have been using a pile of discarded notes as a duplex apartment, and what might be the original non-soot-covered color of your main workbench. The albedo is clearly contagious, spreading its purifying influence beyond the confines of the philosophical egg. Some alchemical traditions view the albedo not just as a transitional stage, but as the achievement of a significant, if intermediate goal, the creation of the lesser stone, the white elixir, or the white rose. This substance was believed to have the power to transmute base metals, not yet into gold but into silver, and was also sometimes credited with potent healing properties. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might find in your readings or see depicted in the strange illustrations of alchemical manuscripts is the White Queen Regina Alba. She is often shown emerging triumphantly from the darkness of Negredo, sometimes being bathed by angels or crowned with silver, symbolizing the purified lunar principle often associated with mercury or silver, now dominant in the alchemical matter. The visual symbolism was, as always, incredibly rich and deeply significant to the initiated. For you, this gleaming white powder or pearly substance in your flask is more precious than any silver. It is the hard-won fruit of your labor, a beacon of hope, and the tangible proof that you are indeed on the path. The serene, luminous whiteness of albedo has brought a much-needed sense of calm and accomplishment to your workshop, and perhaps even a touch of actual literal cleanliness. That pristine, snow-like powder or gleaming, waxy substance in your philosophical egg is a testament to your perseverance through the grim darkness of Negredo. It's a profound relief, a tangible sign that the great work is indeed progressing. But as always in this alchemical marathon, the achievement of one stage is merely the gateway to the next. The ultimate goal, the fiery perfection of the rubedo and the creation of the philosopher's stone, still lies ahead. And between the pure white of the lunar realm and the passionate red of the solar, there often lies a dazzling, if sometimes deceptive interlude, the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail. As you continue to gently heat or otherwise process the white matter from your successful albedo, a truly spectacular phenomenon may begin to unfold within your sealed vessel. The immaculate whiteness starts to give way to a breathtaking array of iridescent colors. Shimmering blues, vivid greens, startling violets, rich yellows and deep purples can chase each other across the surface of the substance or bloom like tiny impossible flowers within its matrix. It's as if a rainbow has been trapped and condensed within your flask. Or as the name suggests, like the unfurling of a peacock's magnificent eye-spotted tail. A mainstream historical fact is that the peacock's tail, cauda pavonis in Latin, is a well-documented phenomenon or stage in many alchemical traditions, typically described as appearing after the albedo whitening and before the rubedo reddening. It's characterized by this dazzling display of multiple shifting iridescent colors within the alchemical vessel, signifying the unfolding of the inner potential of the matter and the harmonious interplay of the elements. The beauty of this stage is undeniable. After the stark monochrome of Negredo and albedo, this sudden explosion of color can feel incredibly magical. A vibrant confirmation that the alchemical matter is truly alive and undergoing profound transformations. Each new hue that emerges, a flash of sapphire, a wash of emerald, brings a fresh wave of excitement and wonder. Your flask currently looks like a tiny, contained psychedelic disco party beamed directly from the heart of the 14th century. If it suddenly starts emitting faint, lute-based trance music, you're officially packing it in for the night and seriously questioning your life choices and possibly the mushrooms the greengrocer sold you last week. However, the alchemical texts also offer a stern warning regarding the peacock's tail. While its appearance is generally considered a positive sign indicating that the soul or spirit of the matter is awakening and its hidden virtues are being made manifest, there's a danger of becoming captivated, of mistaking this transient beauty for the final achievement. It's easy to get sidetracked. Ooh, what a lovely deep sapphire blue, you might exclaim, peering intently at your flask. Perhaps this is it. Maybe I've inadvertently created the legendary elixir of extreme blueness, capable of curing melancholy, or at least making for some very fetching robes. Then, just as you're pondering the potential market for intensely blue elixirs, the color shifts to a rather bilious green and then to a muddy purple, and you remember the sages cautioning you not to become attached to any one particular shade. Alchemy, you reflect, is such an emotional roller coaster, like a really slow, incredibly confusing, and occasionally quite beautiful theme park ride where the main attraction is staring intently at a flask. The alchemist must not become fixated on these fleeting colors, however alluring. The cauda pavonis is a bridge, a passage, not the destination. The true goal is to guide the matter through this riot of chromatic splendor towards the stable, unified, and perfect red. Some alchemists, the text imply, wasted years, even entire lifetimes, chasing a particularly beautiful or elusive color they witnessed during this phase, believing it held the key, only to lose the thread of the great work entirely. Do not be seduced by the fleeting beauty of the many colors. One of great Uncle Alaric's favorite authors intones gravely from a smudged page. You're trying your best to heed this advice, but it's admittedly hard when your primary experiment looks like a unicorn has just sneezed directly into a rainbow. After attending a particularly glittery festival, focus on the red, focus on the red. You find yourself muttering like a mantra while secretly wondering if enchantingly sparkly purple powder has any discernible market value amongst the local nobility. Whether the cauda pavonis was a consistently reproducible chemical phenomenon resulting from specific reactions such as the formation of thin films, exhibiting interference colors, or the appearance of various metallic oxides with distinct hues or a more subjective, occasionally observed effect, whose significance was then amplified by its potent symbolic appeal, is an area of ongoing investigation and lively discussion for historians of science and practicing chemists alike. Certainly the symbolism is rich. This phase is sometimes linked to the rainbow that appeared after Noah's flood, signifying a covenant, a divine promise of the eventual perfection and renewal that awaits at the end of the work. Managing the process during the peacock's tail stage still requires your utmost care and attention. The heat from your athanor must be controlled with precision. The breathtaking colors might appear and fade with surprising rapidity, or they might shift in a slow, stately sequence over many days. You continue your meticulous observations, recording the unchanging kaleidoscope in your journal, noting the order of appearance, the intensity, the duration of each hue. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might encounter is the belief held by some alchemists that the specific sequence and relative intensity of the colors observed during the cauda pavonis could actually predict the specific qualities or particular virtues of the eventual philosopher's stone. A particularly vibrant blue might indicate future success in creating elixirs for ailments related to melancholy, while a strong clear green could suggest powers over fertility or growth. It was almost like an alchemical mood ring offering coded previews of the stone's future applications. For now, your main concern is to navigate this dazzling but distracting display and guide your increasingly colorful matter towards its ultimate fiery destiny. Section 14. The dazzling ephemeral beauty of the peacock's tail with its kaleidoscopic dance of blues, greens, and violets has finally faded from your philosophical egg. That transient riot of color, while a wondrous spectacle and a sign that your alchemical matter was truly alive, was, as the ancient texts warned, merely a bridge. You resisted the temptation to declare victory at sparkly purple or intriguing aquamarine, and patiently guided your evolving substance onward. Now the real test begins. The many colors must resolve into the stable, potent, and legendary red. This is the rubedo, the reddening, the fiery culmination of your alchemical marathon, and hopefully the immediate precursor to the Philosopher's Stone itself. Achieving rubedo, according to Great Uncle Alaric's most revered and most scorched manuscripts, typically requires a significant increase in the intensity of the heat within your athanor. The gentle warmth of the negredo and the moderate heat of albedo and the cauda pavonis are no longer sufficient. Now the matter must be subjected to a stronger, more persistent fire, a heat that will fix its color and its virtues, rendering it stable and incombustible. The athanor is now running hotter than a dragon's annual family barbecue. You're half expecting the clay bricks of the furnace itself to start sweating and lodging formal complaints about excessive working conditions. Your eyebrows, after several near misses with escaping flames and radiant heat, have officially tendered their resignation and are rumored to have relocated to a cooler, less flammable part of your anatomy. This is where the perfected red sulfur, the philosophical gold, the very essence of solar fire, is supposedly brought to its ultimate terrestrial manifestation. A mainstream historical fact is that rubedo, the reddening apawina, is widely recognized as the third final and culminating major stage of the classical alchemical opus following negredo and albedo. It symbolizes the attainment of perfection, the sacred marriage of opposites, often represented as the Red King and White Queen, or Sol and Luna, Sun and Moon, finally united, and the successful creation of the Philosopher's Stone. This stage is universally associated with the sun, the metal gold, and the element of fire in its most purified and potent form. The sensory details of rubedo are fittingly intense. As the heat in your athanor steadily climbs, you watch with bated breath as the contents of your sealed flask undergo their final, magnificent transformation. The various hues of the peacock's tail should coalesce and deepen gradually, resolving into a single profound and unwavering red. Not just any red, but a deep, vibrant ruby red or a fiery crimson, often described as being redder than red itself. Some texts speak of it as a powder incredibly fine and dense. Others describe it as a fusible glass-like substance, clear and brilliant like a precious gem, the red lion or the red poppy of the mountain. The goal is a stable, unchanging redness that can withstand the fiercest fire without losing its color or potency. Any remaining unpleasant odors from previous stages should have long since vanished, ideally replaced, according to some particularly optimistic authors, by a noble, subtle, or even inexplicably fragrant scent. Though in your perennially smoky and chemically diverse workshop, fragrant remains a highly relative and aspirational term. The psychological state you inhabit during this critical phase is a potent cocktail of heightened anticipation, almost unbearable excitement, and a deep, gnawing nervousness. This is it. This is the culmination of years of study, of countless failed experiments of enduring terrible smells, and profound disappointments of spending your last few coins on peculiar rocks and dubious powders. The feeling of being on the very brink of achieving the unachievable, of holding the key to transmutation, and perhaps even immortality in your hands, is overwhelming. You're so antsy waiting for this red to fully stabilize and declare its fiery permanence, you feel you could power a small medieval windmill with your sheer nervous energy. Every time you dare to peek into the glowing heart of the Athenor at your precious flask, your heart performs a complex tap dance routine that would impress a seasoned flamenco master and possibly register on a very rudimentary seismograph. Fear of failure is, of course, equally intense. What if, after all this, it's just red stuff? The precise chemical nature of the red substance produced during a successful rubido is one of the most enduring mysteries and hotly debated topics in the study of alchemy, with modern hypotheses ranging from the formation of red mercuric sulfide cinnabar, if sulfur and mercury are key ingredients, or other metallic oxides like red lead oxide or iron, 3-oxide, to the creation of colloidal gold, microscopically fine particles of gold suspended in a medium which can appear ruby red, or even substances whose striking appearance was perhaps more symbolic or indicative of a particular physical state than chemically distinct in a way we'd easily recognize today, especially given the deliberate secrecy and allegorical language employed by alchemists. Some texts suggest that once the perfect, stable red is achieved, a tiny portion of this red powder, or philosopher's gold, should be tested. The instructions are usually grand and slightly terrifying. A minuscule grain the size of a mustard seed, when projected onto a molten base metal like lead or mercury, is said to be capable of transmuting many thousands of times its own weight into pure, genuine gold. You look at the minuscule, hopefully potent speck of reddish material now glowing in your crucible, assuming you've managed to produce something that looks the part, and then you glance at a nearby lead pipe you've been eyeing for just this occasion. Right! You think your palm's suddenly clammy. No pressure then. Just casually rewrite the fundamental laws of nature as currently understood. Easy peasy. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might have come across in your textual deep dives is the rather peculiar practice advocated by some alchemists of adding a small amount of actual ordinary gold to the mixture during the rubedo stage. This gold was considered a ferment, a kind of seed that would teach or encourage the less noble matter how to achieve the perfected state of goldness. This seems rather counterintuitive if your ultimate goal is to make gold from a non-golden starting materials, but it beautifully highlights the symbolic, like attracts like, and almost vitalistic thinking that permeated much of alchemical philosophy. For now, you can only hope that your own concoction, achieved through sweat smoke and sheer stubbornness, has learned the lesson of redness all by itself. Section 15. The Athenor, your faithful soot-stained companion, through countless alchemical trials, now glows with a fierce, expectant heat. Within its fiery heart, or perhaps carefully set aside in a special crucible, rests the culmination of your life's work to this point. A tiny, precious quantity of a deep, vibrant ruby red powder. The rubido, the philosopher's gold, or so you desperately, fervently hope. The workshop around you is a testament to the arduous journey. It's probably coated in more layers of chemical residue than an ancient battlefield. Your notebooks are filled with cryptic observations and increasingly frantic scribbles, and you yourself are a vision of exhausted, sleep-deprived, yet utterly wired anticipation. Every stage has been navigated, every instruction in Great Uncle Alaric's texts that you could decipher, at least has been followed with painstaking near-religious devotion. Now, all that remains is the final, terrifying, exhilarating act, the projection. A mainstream historical fact is that the projection was the ultimate alchemical experiment, the moment of truth. It involved taking a minuscule amount of the perfected philosopher's stone, often described as being wrapped in a little ball of wax to protect it from the initial heat, and to help it mix and adding it to a larger mass of molten base metal, typically lead or mercury. The expectation built upon centuries of lore and whispered promises was that this tiny speck of perfected matter would transmute the entire base mass into pure, genuine gold or silver. You select your base metal. Lead is the classic choice. Cheap, readily available, and symbolically representing the lowest, most chaotic state from which perfection can arise. You place a solid ingot of it into a clean crucible, which then goes into the roaring Athanor. As the lead begins to soften, then slump, then finally transform into a pool of shimmering liquid silver. Under the intense heat, your heart hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. Now for the stone itself. You retrieve your tiny quantity of red powder. It sits innocuously on a piece of clean parchment, a mere pinch of dust, yet supposedly holding the power to transform worlds, or at least your financial situation and quite possibly the local economy. You handle the tiny speck of red powder with more care than a nervous new parent, handling a priceless Fabergé egg that's also a live ticking grenade. If you sneeze now, your entire life's work. The hopes and dreams of generations of alchemists could end up scattered across the filthy workshop floor like very expensive, slightly magical, and ultimately useless dandruff. Following the traditional method, you carefully enclose the speck in a tiny pellet of beeswax. The moment is at hand. The lead is molten, gleaming dully in the crucible's glow. With trembling fingers, using a pair of iron tongs, you pick up the wax pellet containing your red powder. You take a deep breath or try to. The air in the workshop is as ever a heady mix of smoke, residual chemical ambition, and your own palpable anxiety. You drop the wax-wrapped speck into the molten lead. Time seems to slow down. You can hear your own heartbeat thundering in your ears. You can hear the spiders in the far corners of the workshop collectively holding their tiny arachnid breaths. You can probably hear the distant celestial spheres grinding to a halt and going, "Ooh, this is gonna be good," or really, really spectacularly awkward for the chap in the dirty tunic. What happens next? The texts describe various possibilities: a brilliant flash of light, a sudden change in the color of the molten metal, a bubbling or hissing as the transmutation occurs, a noticeable increase in weight and density. You stare unblinking into the crucible. The wax pellet melts almost instantly. The red powder presumably disperses into the liquid lead. And then nothing particularly dramatic. The lead remains, well, lead. It might be slightly shinier lead now, perhaps with a faint reddish tinge on its surface where the powder met it. Maybe it's even philosophical lead, deeply contemplative about its own immutable leaden nature and its brief flirtation with greatness. But it is unequivocally still lead. There is no flash of gold, no miraculous transformation. Your stone, it appears, was more of a pebble, an expensive, reddish, beautifully symbolic, and ultimately hope-crushing pebble. The silence in the workshop is profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the Athanor, and the dull thud of your dreams hitting the grimy floor. The crushing weight of disappointment is a physical thing pressing down on your shoulders, making it hard to breathe.